I'm sorry, but are we really suggesting that countries like Spain, Italy, France, places with piazzas, sculpted marble, high-tech public transportation, and excellent centers of education and research are poorer than Mississippi? No offense to Mississippi, but come on now. Measuring a country's gross domestic product per capita and comparing it to the US has made for some pretty emotionally charged headlines over the years. From Australia to the United Kingdom, Germany to Canada, wealth and relative poverty are clear concerns, and GDP per capita is often used as a metric for gauging overall economic opportunities. But what is GDP per capita actually measuring? What is it good at telling us? What is it not so great about telling us about the relative wealth and well-being of workers within a country? And is there a better metric that could give us insights onto the health of global economies? Well, let's take a look. Before we can make statements like this headline from Euronews, statisticians and economists must try to solve an important problem. How do we compare the prosperity of two countries with different economies, different standards of living, and different currencies? There are a few ways to analyze a country's wealth and prosperity, but GDP, or gross domestic product per capita, is overwhelmingly the most universal because its components are regularly tracked on a global scale, providing ease of calculation and usage. The basic formula for calculating GDP is to divide the gross domestic product, or the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country during a specific time period, usually a year, by the number of people living in the country during that time. The reason this is such an important indicator is that higher economic output is usually associated with higher household incomes. In other words, when an economy generates more value per person per year, that typically translates into more money for those working in that economy. Higher incomes mean families can spend more on the things they value. They can afford groceries and rent without financial stress, get the dental care they need, send their children to university, and maybe even take a family vacation. It also typically means that governments have a greater capacity to provide public services, such as education, healthcare, and other social assistance programs. As a result, higher GDP per capita is often associated with positive outcomes in a wide range of areas, such as better health, more education, and even greater life satisfaction. And so in this regard, GDP per capita definitely gets used as kind of a catch-all when we talk about relative wealth and prosperity from one place to another. And specifically when we look here in Europe, there are reasons to ring the alarm when it comes to GDP per capita trends that we've seen over the last few decades. Since 2008, nominal US GDP has outpaced that of the European Union to the point that the EU is now just 2/3 of the economy that the US is, rather than a prior near parity. But these aren't reasons for American triumphalism, let alone reasons to claim that America is somehow unfathomably wealthier than other European nations. Though it is tempting to use GDP per capita as an all-encompassing measurement of prosperity, it doesn't tell us the full story. For instance, though GDP per capita is an indirect measure of average income, it doesn't necessarily mean that the typical person in that economy earns this amount. In US states like Mississippi, GDP per capita tends to be much higher than the average income because of the tremendous value generated by their capital-intensive manufacturing, finance, insurance, and real estate industries. GDP per capita here is $53,872, but the per capita income is just $30,529. To keep continuity in our analysis here for comparison, we do not see that same discrepancy in Germany, where the GDP per capita is $54,343, and the average income per person is adjusted to $54,718. The other big issue with GDP per capita is that it's often used as a kind of metric for measuring wealth. But again, that's also not entirely accurate. Consider two people with equal salaries, but one has $1 million in the bank and is adding to it, while the other has just $6,000 in the bank and is spending more than he or she earns. Nations, too, can overspend from savings and rack up enormous debt, but GDP tells us nothing about the size of the stock they have to draw from or their debt obligations. It merely measures the income flow. So the US, for reference, has staggering national debt of $106,110 per person. Germany, in contrast, was just €30,930 per person. The US hasn't had a balanced budget, meaning a match between what the government spends and its revenue, since 2001, when Bill Clinton left office. Meanwhile, prioritizing a mostly balanced budget, or a debt brake as we call it in Germany, is legally binding for federal and state governments.